was adamant. He says, I don't want a comedian. I don't want a comic actor for this role. This is a heavyweight part. I want an actor.
He was the soul of the Karate Kid, the quiet handyman whose wisdom shaped not only Daniel LaRusso, but an entire generation of moviegoers. Yet behind Mr. Miyagi's calm eyes and clipped words stood a man carrying battles no one ever saw. Pat Morita, the actor who brought Miyagi to life, had faced rejection, heartbreak, and a fight to even step into the role that would define him forever. For years he stayed silent about what really happened behind the cameras. But near the end of his life, Morita revealed the truth, a story of doubt, persistence, and fate that almost robbed the world of Mr. Miyagi. This isn't just about wax on, wax off. It's about how Hollywood nearly erased one of its most unforgettable characters, and how a single twist of destiny changed everything. When people think of the Karate Kid, they picture Mr. Miyagi, the mentor whose quiet wisdom carried Daniel through every struggle. But what fans didn't know at the time is that Pat Morita, the man behind Miyagi, was almost never given the chance to audition. In Hollywood, Morita had been labeled as a comedian. To producers, he was the funny guy from TV, quick with a punchline, but incapable of playing a character scarred by war and loss. And Jerry Weintraub, the powerful producer overseeing the project, made his feelings crystal clear. He didn't want a comic anywhere near Miyagi. That wall seemed unbreakable. Every time Morita's name came up in casting conversations, Weintraub shut it down. Other actors were called in, men with serious reputations and heavy resumes. To the Hollywood elite, they looked the part. Pat Morita? He wasn't even on the list. But this wasn't just about one role. For Morita, it was about survival. His career was fading, the spotlight slipping away, and now even the one opportunity that could save him was being blocked by a single voice of authority. Yet fate has a strange way of rewriting stories. While Weintraub built walls, director John Avildsen was determined to knock them down. Avildsen, who had already turned underdogs into icons with Rocky, wasn't about to let potential go unseen. He demanded that every possible actor, even those dismissed as unfit, be given a chance, and that demand cracked open the door for Pat Morita to step inside. But what he didn't know then was that this door would lead him into the most unlikely twist of his career, one that almost never happened. By the early 1980s, Pat Morita's career was running on fumes. He had tasted fame before, from stand-up clubs to his breakout role on Happy Days. But the calls had slowed, and Hollywood seemed to have moved on. Instead of chasing auditions, he drifted to Hawaii, picking up whatever work came his way, hosting political fundraisers, writing ad copy, even performing in small nightclubs. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't steady. And for Morita, it felt like treading water while waiting for something that might never come to the outside world. His career looked like it was fading into quiet obscurity. Then came a decision that seemed small at the time. He let his hair and beard grow out. Not for a role, not for an image makeover, simply because he felt like it. He later joked that he looked more like a hippie than an actor. But without realizing it, that beard became his silent audition. It gave him a weathered look, a face that carried history, hardship, and wisdom. And just when he was ready to give up, fate intervened. One afternoon, after nearly letting go of his agent, Morita was walking out the door when he was called back. His agent held a script in his hands, The Karate Kid. It was the last thing Morita expected, a film he wasn't even supposed to be considered for. He almost didn't take it seriously. But that scruffy beard, his timing, and the coincidence of still being under contract, lined up like puzzle pieces he never could have arranged himself. He read the script, he agreed to audition. And in that moment, destiny turned a fading comedian into a contender for the role that would define him forever. But nothing about this audition would be ordinary. When Morita finally stepped into the room, he found himself face to face with one man, a camera, and a test unlike anything he had seen before. When Pat Morita walked into his audition for The Karate Kid, he expected the usual Hollywood setup: a panel of producers, casting directors scribbling notes, maybe even a writer in the corner. Instead, he found something completely different. Sitting in the room was director John Avildsen, but he wasn't behind a desk. He had a camera strapped to his shoulder, a battery pack across his chest, and his eye pressed to the lens. From the moment Morita stepped through the door, he was already being filmed. There was no small talk, no warm-up scene. Avildsen asked, "Tell me a little about yourself," and Morita did. Not rehearsed lines, not jokes, but real stories about his life. The ups, the downs, the grind of show business, the years of doubt. What Avildsen captured wasn't just an actor auditioning, it was a man exposing his truth. Then came the script. Instead of reciting lines with polish, Morita leaned into the raw emotion of Miyagi. Grief, wisdom, and quiet strength, all rolled into one. He didn't perform the role. He lived it, even in that bare room with no costumes, no sets, and no Daniel LaRusso to play against. When it was over, Morita assumed it had gone nowhere. He started to leave, but Avildsen stopped him with one line that would change everything. "Pat, don't you want to take your script with you? You might need it." It was the first sign that someone finally saw him as Miyagi. In that moment, Morita realized he might have broken through the wall of doubt that had haunted him for weeks. But this was just the beginning. If he wanted the role, he would have to prove himself again and again. Not once, not twice, but 5 separate times. For most actors, one strong audition is enough. But for Pat Morita, landing Mr. Miyagi required something closer to a marathon. Even after John Avildsen's audition tape impressed skeptics, the producers weren't convinced. To them, he was still the comedian from TV, and they needed proof over and over again. So began a gauntlet of 5 separate tests, each one designed to strip away any excuse the studio might have had to say no. The first test was simple. Could Morita recreate the same quiet intensity from his original audition? He did. With calm authority and subtle emotion, he showed them Miyagi wasn't a cartoon or a parody. He was flesh and blood. The second test pushed further. Could he hold on to that balance without slipping into comedy? Again, Morita delivered. His timing, once used for jokes, became a tool for silence, for pauses that carried more weight than words. The third test raised the stakes: chemistry. Ralph Macchio was flown in from New York to see if the bond between Daniel and Miyagi felt real. What unfolded wasn't scripted magic, it was human connection. Morita listened, reacted, and guided naturally. Macchio leaned on him as if he were a real mentor. The room knew it. This was the heart of the film. But producers still weren't ready to commit. The fourth test put Morita in costume. Dressed in a simple gi, with his beard and weathered face, he transformed. The comedian vanished. What stood before them looked like a man who had lived through hardship, who carried scars you couldn't see. Even Macchio admitted later that the transformation was startling. It was like Miyagi had stepped into the room. Finally came the fifth and most brutal test. A cold, empty soundstage. No props, no sets, no music, just Morita, Macchio, and a camera. The producers wanted to see if the magic held when everything else was stripped away, and it did. The silence between the two spoke louder than any dialogue. For those watching, it wasn't acting anymore. It was real. By the end of the fifth test, doubt had begun to crumble. Morita hadn't just auditioned. He had proved beyond question that he was Mr. Miyagi. But one final obstacle still stood in his way. The same producer who had fought hardest to keep him out. And only one phone call could decide Morita's future. Even after 5 flawless tests, one shadow still hung over Pat Morita's future: Jerry Weintraub. The powerful producer who had dismissed him from the very beginning still wasn't convinced. To Weintraub, Pat Morita was a comic who couldn't possibly carry the gravitas of Mr. Miyagi. and until he gave the final word, the role remained out of reach. Then came the ultimate test. In front of studio heads, Morita and Ralph Macchio performed a quiet, intimate scene. No fighting, no crane kick, just a broken man speaking to a boy who needed guidance. The pauses, the halting rhythm, the weight behind every word, it silenced the entire room. When the camera stopped, there was no laughter, no skepticism, only stillness. Everyone knew what they had just seen. Pat Morita wasn't acting. He was Miyagi. That night, the phone rang. On the other end was Jerry Weintraub. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, carried something different this time. "Pat," he said, "I almost made the worst mistake of my life. I just want to be the first to congratulate you. You've got the part of Miyagi." For Morita, it was more than a casting call. It was redemption. The man who had fought so hard against him was now admitting defeat. The wall that had stood in his way for weeks had finally crumbled. Pat didn't gloat. He didn't remind Weintraub how close he had come to shutting the door forever. Instead, with quiet pride, he accepted. He knew this victory wasn't just about winning a role, it was about rewriting how Hollywood saw him, not as a comedian, but as an artist. But landing the part was only half the battle. Now Morita faced a new challenge, giving Miyagi a voice that the world would never forget. Winning the role of Mr. Miyagi was one thing, bringing him to life was another. Pat Morita knew from the beginning that Miyagi's voice would make or break the character. Too polished, and he'd sound unbelievable as a Japanese immigrant who learned English later in life. Too exaggerated, and it risked slipping into stereotype. The balance had to be perfect. Ironically, the first spark came by accident. During his grueling audition process, Morita was exhausted. His energy was low, his words slowed, and sentences came out in short-clipped bursts. Instead of hurting him, that rhythm struck a chord. The pauses gave weight to every word, and the broken English carried dignity instead of mockery. Morita leaned into it, shaping Miyagi's speech into something deeper, halting, thoughtful, almost poetic. Each pause felt deliberate, like a man who weighed every word before letting it go. A man who catches flies with chopsticks can accomplish anything, simple, sparse, but unforgettable. At first, some in the studio worried. Would audiences laugh for the wrong reasons? Was it too risky? But when paired with Morita's sincerity, the cadence became part of Miyagi's wisdom. Instead of a weakness, it was his strength. It made people lean in, listen closer, and believe. Fans were stunned years later when they saw Morita in interviews, quick-tongued, witty, and smooth-spoken. They could hardly believe this was the same man behind Miyagi's halting, meditative delivery. That was Morita's artistry. He created a voice so real, people thought it wasn't acting at all. The broken rhythm turned into something larger than an accent. It became a character in itself, etched into pop culture, echoed by kids on playgrounds and comedians on stage. But behind the imitations, the truth remained. Morita had taken something fragile and turned it into poetry. And yet, even as he perfected Miyagi's voice, Morita found himself confronting a deeper challenge, proving he was more than just a character. On set, he would have to bare his soul in moments that no one expected, creating scenes that would leave the crew in stunned silence. For Pat Morita, the Karate Kid wasn't just another job, it was a second life. The world remembers the crane kick and the wax-on, wax-off lessons, but what Morita carried were quieter moments, the kind that stayed with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. One of the most powerful was the drunk Miyagi scene. The studio didn't even want it included. Executives worried that showing Miyagi vulnerable, broken by memories of losing his wife and child in an internment camp, would ruin the mystique of the wise mentor. But Morita fought for it. He poured his soul into the performance, stumbling through grief with such raw honesty that when the cameras stopped, the entire crew fell silent. No applause, no chatter, just silence. That night, Morita proved he could do more than make people laugh. He could make them weep. Another moment was lighter, the famous fly-catching scene. On paper, it was simple comedy. Miyagi trying and failing to snatch a fly with chopsticks. But Morita played it with childlike seriousness, his hands steady, his eyes locked in concentration. When Daniel beats him to it, their laughter feels spontaneous, unforced. It was in scenes like that, Morita later said, where Miyagi stopped being just a teacher and became something more, a man with humor, humility, and heart. Off-screen, his bond with Ralph Macchio became just as real. Ralph was a teenager, suddenly thrown into fame, and Morita, decades older, took on a protective role. He offered guidance with humor, sharing life lessons in the same gentle way Miyagi did on camera. Years later, Macchio would describe their relationship as the true heart of the movie, on screen and off. Even the crew, once skeptical of whether a comedian could carry such a role, slowly changed. By the time filming wrapped, the stunt team and technicians no longer saw Pat Morita, the sitcom comic. They saw Sensei Miyagi. They treated him with the same respect they gave the character, proof that he had transformed more than just the audience's perception. Morita himself cherished these small rituals, staying in character between takes, mumbling bits of Miyagi wisdom to crew members who started jokingly seeking advice from him. To Pat, it meant Miyagi had become more than a role. He was alive to everyone on set. Those moments, laughter, silence, mentorship, were what gave the Karate Kid its soul. And for Morita, they were memories he would carry until the end of his life. But as the years went by, he came to realize something even more profound. Mr. Miyagi hadn't just changed audiences, he had changed Pat Morita himself. By the time Pat Morita looked back on his life, one truth stood above all the rest. Mr. Miyagi hadn't just been a role he played, he had been a gift that shaped him as much as he shaped it. For decades, Morita had been seen as the comedian, the side character, the man with the quick punchline. But through Miyagi, he became something else entirely, an artist who could make audiences laugh, cry, and reflect, sometimes all in the same scene. He often said that the Karate Kid saved him. Without it, his career might have quietly faded away. Instead, it gave him a second chance, not just at success, but at respect. Hollywood, which once dismissed him, now celebrated him. Audiences didn't just remember his jokes, they remembered his wisdom, his gentleness, and the quiet strength he poured into Miyagi. Even near the end of his life, Morita would reflect on those days with gratitude. He spoke about the friendships, the lessons, and the memories that went far beyond movie sets or box office numbers. What mattered most wasn't the crane kick or the quotable lines, it was the impact, the way people, generation after generation, looked at Miyagi not as a character, but as a mentor they wished they'd had. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy of all. A man nearly shut out of the role became the heart of it. A comedian dismissed as not serious enough became the very soul of a story that continues to inspire. Without Pat Morita, The Karate Kid would have been just another movie. With him, it became timeless. For Pat, Miyagi was more than a role. He was proof that sometimes the greatest victories don't come from fighting, but from perseverance, humility, and the courage to keep going when the world says you can't.